Oh,
We're
shit.
broadcasting right now. Okay, we're having panelists come in. So Tyler, we're going to go ahead and check this out real quick. And if you're here, everyone, we are early, just a little bit. We're going to just test out a few of the functions here when it comes to everything. So I'll go ahead and share that. That's good. And then Tyler, I'll go ahead and stop sharing so you can test out your functionality there.
Remind me where the share screen thing is, Joe.
Control panel at the bottom or the top there, depending upon where you're at.
Let's see here.
All right, and if you just logged in here as an attendee, we're a little bit early. I pressed the broadcast button a little bit early, so you get to see all the testing, the behind the scenes work that usually happens there. So I'm sure Tyler's thrilled at me to do this. So we're all watching him play around with sharing his screen, but.
No, I'm failing. Oh, there it is. Share.
All right. And in the spirit of such things, I'm going to share a link with everybody. It's going to go in the chat. If you haven't played it already, I have here webinar bingo. So it's different than conference call bingo. So feel free to go ahead and use that as we get ready for this. We're going to get started here in about 6 minutes. So feel free to go get some coffee, water, and we'll get started here shortly.
Hey, Joe, can you see my presentation okay? Can you hear me talking?
Perfect. All you can see right now is just.
Why don't we do this can you just give me 2 seconds to sign back in and we'll see if I can get it up and running. I'm really sorry, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go ahead and get you back in there and I'll answer some of these questions that are on here right now. So that being said, one of the questions that was brought up was, I've heard that the new CARES Act that passed today allows for forgiveness of loans to cover payroll if we keep all staff on payroll. What if I keep everyone on, but some people are scared to come in and file for unemployment? Does it still get forgiven? So that's one that I'll talk with Tyler on. I know until the final form is approved, depending upon if something is line item vetoed or not, it's going to be difficult to answer that until the final is approved, and it may already been signed into law already. Things are changing by the minute, so we'll definitely have Tyler talk about that a little later on here. So that's something when it comes to, it may still be in flux. It may get fleshed out here as soon as we see the final law go into place right there. So absolutely. Let's see here. All right. Give Tyler here a few minutes. Be able to go ahead and get that taken care of. I appreciate you all for your patience there. He's going to try and sign back on. He's having a little technical difficulty with his computer there. All right. All right. There we go, Tyler.
Hey.
Fantastic.
All right.
Superman there. Nice.
I'm really sorry about that, everyone. Let's try this now.
I think that's one of the squares of bingo. So at least somebody's winning right now.
Let's see here. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Good to go.
Good to go. All right, everyone. Hey, I'm really sorry about that. I will go quick, though, to get us caught up. My name is Tyler Jones. I'm an attorney. I work primarily in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, working with healthcare providers, particularly veterinarians like yourself. That's probably about 90% of my practice is helping veterinarians with business and employment needs that they may have in the course of their practice. So when Joe was kind enough to invite me to speak, I really appreciated it. So an opportunity, like he said, to give back to veterinarians is really important to me. So I will go ahead and get started. We're in the middle of a crisis. And so whenever clients call me and they're having a crisis, I usually kind of walk through and trying my best to be as analytical as possible about things you can do, some of which Joe's already talked about. I think all signs point to this crisis probably getting worse before it gets better. And so to the extent your veterinary hospital or clinic is up in flux, you need to be prepared to kind of deal with those issues as they arise. And hopefully going through this presentation will help you in that process. The first thing I would tell you is that if your clinic is struggling, remember that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You're not going to be able to put out every fire in one day. Don't try, you'll burn out. Joe talked already a lot about identifying and handling cash flow concerns, so we can skip through that. Later on, we're going to talk about employment issues that could arise in the course of your practice and how to navigate that. And likewise, we'll start talking about some things you can do once we get on the other side of these shelter-in-place orders that are in place in Oregon and Washington, so that you can start planning for how your clinic will run in that world. So before we jump in, let's just kind of go over and get a little bit of a lay of the land from where we're at. So I'll do Oregon first, just because my sense is more people here are from Oregon than Washington, is that Oregon is currently under Executive Order 2012. This means that veterinarians are not included in the temporary business closures. However, under Executive Order 2010, which was issued just previously, veterinary hospitals do need to cease all elective and non-urgent procedures. The point of this is not necessarily because they're concerned that veterinarians are going to spread COVID or that people are in veterinary offices causing an issue there. It's to preserve PPE, so personal protective equipment, the N95 masks you've been hearing so much about. Oregon currently has it set so that no elective procedures should be scheduled until after June 15th. For those of us in Washington, we're under Proclamation 2025, which says that veterinarians are essential critical infrastructure workers. As of this morning, when I updated this deck at 9:15, there is no measure in place that limits what a veterinarian can provide in terms of services to patients and clients in the state of Washington. That being said, almost every veterinarian I speak with in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska is struggling in keeping controls in place for their PPE. A lot of them have donated their N95 masks to local hospitals and ERs, but they're struggling to get gloves. I had one client send me a picture of some weird off-market gloves that he had to get in order to run his practice this morning, and they were strange looking. I say that just because for our Washington practitioners, just because you're allowed to keep practicing doesn't necessarily mean that your practices and procedures are allowed to fall below the standard of care. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what you can be doing in terms of reusing PPE that safely and mitigates your exposure for liability reasons. The American Veterinary Medical Association has given us some guidance on March 20th. I'd encourage you to go look at their website. They have some really useful stuff. And then Oregon has also updated with a list of procedures that is that veterinarians are allowed to move forward. Most of my veterinary clients have not been in a position where they've had to lay off a ton of employees, though I'm no doubt that some of you have had to make that tough decision. I would encourage you, if you're in that place or about to be in that place, to be proactive. Go to your local employment department if you're in Oregon's website, or if you're in Washington, it's called Employment Security. Go to those websites and see what resources are available for you and your employer or employees. Every day we're seeing changes in the law as it relates to unemployment that spurs from or comes from COVID-19. And so every day it's getting better and better for people who may have their workplace impacted, even for owners at this point. We'll talk a little bit about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that got passed late last week. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the CARES Act, which I think passed about 25 minutes ago. Before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about some best practices that you can put in your veterinary clinic right now that'll help you weather this storm as things get possibly a little bit weirder in the next few weeks. So the first thing I'm telling people is review your local association's rules and the guidance they're putting out. That the stuff that WSVMA and OVMA are putting out on a daily basis is fantastic. I'm reading it. It's my first thing I hit when I get my coffee in the morning. Make sure you're reading it. They've got great guidance on the reuse of PPE. A lot of it's really thorough, or it references the Department of Health, OSHA, Center for Disease, or CDA, excuse me. TLDR, that's lawyer talk for too long, didn't read. If that's all too much for you to process, there's this great blog by Dr. Weiss called Worms and Germs blog. He's a veterinarian, and he's got a great article about the reuse of PPE, how to sterilize it, how to keep it up and going, and what kind of controls you can put in place with your staff, associate veterinarians, to maximize the use of the PPE so that it can be used both in your own practice, and you can make sure that as much of the PPE is going to our hospitals to deal with this crisis as possible. Additionally, the AVMA has put out some additional guidance, and after this this presentation, I'll make sure that an email of all these great links and resources gets blasted out to you through Omni. The big thing I'm counseling my veterinary practice owners is you need to communicate these expectations with staff. If they're putting gowns on for veterinary treatment, what are the tolerances from when you need to reuse a gown and when you don't? Same things with what masks you may or may not be using in your practice, and gloves. So communicate those expectations. That'll help keep your costs low and keep your supplies up so that you can continue to treat animals during this difficult time. The second biggest batch of questions I'm getting from my veterinary clients are the intake of patients. How do we handle that? It runs the gamut. I have one huge veterinary clinic that is up in Alaska that I called to see how he was handling it, and he said he wasn't doing anything differently at all. That obviously scared me a little, and we had a long talk. Then I had another clinician down in Oregon who I spoke with just this morning, and she has this great policy in place. It's where you call from the parking lot, you say what the situation is, why you're coming in, if you have an appointment scheduled, and to the extent possible, the employees are walking out to the car, picking up the animal and bringing it into the clinic for its treatment. And then they're Skyping or FaceTiming with the owner to the extent necessary once the animal's been examined. That's been working great for them, they say, and the owners or the animal owners are totally fine with it and very respectful of it. The nice part about that for you as practice owners or people working in a veterinary practice is that you are mitigating your own exposure as people come and go from the practice, because you're mitigating how many people are entering the clinic during a workday. I've yet to have or hear of anyone complaining about it, and it seems to be working really well. Further on the intake of patients issue, especially if you're in Oregon, you need to be asking yourself, is this an emergency? Is this something that could cause a major issue if it's not treated in the next 3 months? Is kind of the litmus test that Governor Brown put in her executive order. And as I talked about, your big goal is not necessarily, it's in addition to preserving PPE, it's about protecting your staff from risks of COVID-19 exposure. So by putting different processes in place to make sure that it's not the wild, wild west in your clinic, and that you're controlling how many people are in there, that you're maintaining social distance of 6 feet apart, you're protecting your staff, which is essentially your best asset. So I would highly encourage you to have a staff meeting to talk about rules related to what processes you want to put in place in your practice. Another question I'm getting every day is you do not have to provide services to someone if an owner comes in and they're sick. You can ask them to go sit in their car. You can say, we need someone else to drop off that animal. All the above, whatever you're comfortable with. But the last thing you want to do as an employer, both from a moral perspective and a liability perspective, is put your staff at risk because you wanted to get one more exam in or one more vaccination in. It's just not worth it. So really think how you can use, telephones, Skype, internet, telemedicine to accomplish what you were accomplishing prior to this outbreak. The third big question I'm getting is, what's the rule with exams? I can't give out a prescription unless I've been within 1 year of an exam. In Washington, they've released guidance that says it's in the best judgment of the doctor since we're under emergency situations. I've talked to some veterinarians, and my advice has been, and they've kind of echoed it, is, and I think AVMA and AHA, as well as a lot of the various local associations have echoed this, is it's in your best judgment about what you're comfortable doing with your license, the need of the animal. My advice is chart the file heavily, explain why you arrived at the conclusion you did. And if you're normally a quick charter, maybe spend some extra time if you're going to be prescribing medicine outside of that 1 year window, if that's in Washington. Oregon has been fantastic. They've got a ton of guidance on it. If you go to Executive Order 2003, veterinarians have the option to provide exams electronically. You want to follow the rules set forth by OVMA on how to do that. And your standard for prescribing medicine is not in the best judgment. It's you may prescribe if you think it's safe and appropriate. So it's a little bit more flexible, but I think both states have put out some guidance for us that's hopefully helpful and as you kind of navigate these waters. The last thing, now that both Oregon and Washington have a shelter-in-place order, is if you're having employees and staff come into your practice, you should give them a letter on your clinic or hospital's letterhead saying that they're an essential employee, that they work for you, and that they're coming to and from work. I haven't really heard of any issues of people getting stopped as they're traveling, but that letter will help protect them and get them to work sooner if someone were to pull them over on their way to work. Joe talked a lot about creditors. I'll just talk, my thing is always, identify those liabilities that if you are struggling right now, or we get to a place where practices need to start closing down temporarily, identify those loans that you're personally responsible for. So Joe talked about your veterinary practice loan, the one you got from your lender, your lease, you most likely signed a personal guarantee for your lease. Talk about your student loans, things that you have personal liability for that you can't rely on the shield that your business entity creates for you. Work through those first. Another thing I would say is veterinarians are great people to do business with. Joe could probably speak to it better than I can, but Joe, what's the default rate for veterinarians?
It's the lowest out of any medical fields. It's typically most lenders have a portfolio default rate of less than 1%, and in some cases less than 0.5%. So historically phenomenal.
You guys are fantastic, and Joe may disagree, but my experience with veterinarians is you'll pay the people you owe money to before you pay yourself almost every single time. And so that's a testament to, who you guys are as people. I would say that if things get difficult or you're in a position where cash flow isn't as great as it should be, go ahead and convert yourself and think about which bills you're paying, what are net 30, what bills that you've historically paid within 30 days, and see if you can slide some of those to net 60 or 90. The last thing I was talking about is there's a lot of miscommunication out there. We have some extensions for taxes. One thing I'm counseling all my clients is do not borrow from your payroll taxes. So don't not file your Form 941 at the end of the quarter. Don't miss your deposit schedule if you're paying employees wages. Those taxes come with personal liability, and it's really hard to get caught up if you fall behind. So talk to your CPA if you want to take advantage of some of the delays in payment, some of the delays in filing for your state and local taxes, absolutely. But payroll taxes need to be kind of set aside. They're holier than others, and you should be really careful about delaying payment on those. Also, in the last few days, we've seen a ton of state and federal tax relief. Make sure you're giving your CPA a call. They're going to be happy to talk to you about what your options are to kind of delay or mitigate payment on those. Let's see here. Creditor management. Joe talked a lot about this. I'll focus here a little bit later on dealing with your lease, but these are just some things that I'm seeing a lot of people dealing with. I'll just say it right now. I've heard from 4 or 5 people that Antec and IDEX are going around offering people some new leases on equipment. Maybe now is not the best time to sign long-term contracts, so you should talk with your CPA or at least sit on that for a little bit before you sign up for a new lab contract to get a new piece of equipment. Sometimes those can at times be a bit predatory, so be careful with that. I've heard from several people that those vendors are making the rounds. So some strategies from dealing with your landlord. If cash flow is tight for you right now and your landlord bill, your rent every month is your biggest expense for your clinic, here's some things to do. Is first thing, go dust off that lease that you signed 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 or 30 years ago and see what it says. Many leases have what's called a force majeure clause. Force majeure is French, I think, for act of God or acts of God. And it deals with unforeseeable circumstances. Now, not all force majeure clauses are equal. Some are really favorable, I'm finding, that say, hey, if there's an act of God, including a government shutdown or some mandatory thing that's prohibiting you from practicing, you and the landlord have to get together and work out a reasonable situation. That's on one end of the spectrum. There are other force majeure clauses that say, hey, if performance is excused because of acts of God, however, the only thing that isn't excused isn't the payment of rent. So they're not all the same. Just because you have a force majeure clause in your lease doesn't mean you're fully protected. Go ahead and give your attorney a call, whoever helped you with it, and ask them to just kick the tires on it to see if that'll be any help for you. Even if you don't have a force majeure clause, if your practice is having a hard time right now managing cash flow, go ahead and reach out to your landlord if you need it, and I'll give you some strategies. Is the people who call me and say, hey, Tyler, I called my landlord in Portland or I called my landlord in Anchorage and they're not willing to budge. 99% of the time, it's because they were kind of too amorphous in their demands. Landlords don't like to negotiate against themselves. So don't call and say, hey, I can't pay rent right now. Really struggling with some of these executive orders and governor proclamations. I don't know when I'll be able to pay full freight again. Landlords hate that. They don't know what you're saying. They don't understand it. They're very simple people. All they care about is checks. So what you have to do as in your situation is give them some fixed and determinable timelines. Say, hey, it's June 15th or May 18th, or maybe it's 90 days out. I've had a lot of success with 90 days. You just go, hey, for 90 days, I need some help here. And point to the proclamation from Governor Brown, point to the lack of PPE that you're able to get. Talk about things that are harming you in Washington and Oregon, especially, like I said, point to those governor proclamations and say, hey, this isn't me failing as a business owner. This isn't me struggling because I don't know what I'm doing. This is a government order, and I'm bound to uphold these rules. And if you say, I need some 90 days help here, a lot of landlords are being really flexible in that. But don't just come to them, as I said, with, hey, I can't pay and I don't know when I'm going to be able to start. It's not a great strategy. Another thing that you can do is if that doesn't move the needle for them, just say, hey, if you have a triple net lease, say, I'm just talking about my base rent. I'll continue to pay my CAM charges and operating expenses. That can kind of sweeten the pot for landlords too, because then they're not coming out of pocket for those few months where maybe you're not paying base rent. If even still they're not willing to help you out, a common thing that we've been doing is you say, hey, whatever I don't pay you during this 30, 60, 90-day period, we can either amortize that out over the remainder of my lease. So I'll pay a little extra for the rest of my lease if you can give me a little love right now and help me through this difficult time. So we'll stretch it out. Or two, once these proclamations and executive orders are lifted, give me 90 days and I'll true it back up with you. That's especially increasingly more doable once we talk a little bit more about the SBA stuff and the CARES Act that got passed today. So with those kind of 3 strategies with dealing with landlords, we're seeing a lot of success. The only ones I've really struggled with are some of the big downtown Portland and Seattle ones who are really institutional. But most landlords have been super flexible. The other thing I would say about dealing with your landlord is if your landlord starts asking you to provide financial statements, check with your attorney first. Most leases are fine with that, but there are a handful of leases out there that have it that if you ever turn over financials that show that your business is insolvent, you're technically in default. Um, I don't know that anything would ever come of that, but it's something you want to run by your attorney. Most new practice owners, because of the amount of debt that they had to take on to acquire the practice, are on paper insolvent. That doesn't mean it's not a good business. It just means that they have more debt on it than maybe the value of the assets, because goodwill doesn't generally show up on a balance sheet. As I talked about, give the landlord a time frame. Don't make them negotiate against yourself. And feel free to call your attorney to paper whatever deal you worked out with the landlord. It's usually just one piece of paper just saying, hey, we all agree this is how we're going to handle it. That way it's in writing so no one can scream foul down the road. And there's a ton of great real estate brokers I know out there. Steve Kakikis at Omni has been fantastic, helping clients and practitioners with their vet clinic leases and negotiating and reaching out to landlords. He's the best. So reach out to your real estate broker if you don't have one, or maybe now is a great time to establish that relationship to give you a hand if you're not, if maybe you're a little bit more conflict adverse or you feel a little intimidated by your landlord. Joe already talked about this. The one thing that I would say is that there has been a lot of questions that I've been getting. Hey, Tyler, I have business interruption insurance on my general commercial liability policy. Can that help me here? The short answer is no. Most business interruption insurance policy writers have what's called have a requirement that there be damage to personal property. Currently, what we're seeing is COVID-19 doesn't necessarily result in damage to your personal property. So most insurance carriers for veterinary practices aren't picking it up. That being said, it's not like car insurance. You don't get dinged if you make a claim. So if you want to tender a claim, you absolutely can. Every day the government's coming out with more and more relief. So you certainly can't make it worse, but I'm getting a lot of people who are feeling frustrated that the insurance companies are not helping them. And more often than not, the business interruption insurance, or sometimes it's called business continuity insurance, isn't picking it up. Now, before I jump to the next slide, one thing you all should think about as you start thinking about, well, what's the new normal going to be, is if you don't have disability insurance, or even if you do, call your broker for your disability insurance and say, hey, what happens if I get COVID-19? And maybe I'm out for 2 weeks and then I have a 14-day quarantine period. Will my disability insurance policy pick that up so that I can have some overhead coverage while I'm out of the practice? That's especially true if you're a one-person clinic. But even if you have multiple veterinarians who could cover for you, go ahead and reach out to your insurance provider who picks up your disability insurance and see if there's some things you can do now to cover you in the event you're unable to practice due to COVID-19. Joe, did you have a question? I saw you came off mute. You good?
Oh no, just waiting. There's a few other questions from the Q&A, but
do you want to take a break and I can answer some, or you want to just power through?
Yeah, let's have a few of these questions that have risen to the top, address those, we can jump back in.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's see here.
So the first one is,
yeah,
I've heard that the new CARES Act that passed today allows for forgiveness of loans to cover payroll if we keep all the staff on payroll. What if I keep everyone on, but some people are scared to come in and file for unemployment? Does it still get forgiven?
I haven't read the full and final act. I read the one that was kicked around yesterday, and there's going to be a lot of rules and regulations. So I with that overlay, that it's a little bit still uncertain. To answer your immediate question, generally speaking, if they refuse to come into work because they're concerned, you're probably in a situation where they may have abandoned their job. So you could continue to pay them, I suppose, if you wanted to, and rely on the CARES Act to cover you for that time. But I think there'll probably be some rules and regulations that address that. And I think there's probably some other HR concerns there about, what's going on in my practice where they're refusing to come in. One thing you do need to think about in that situation is the CARES Act is clear, is that if you pull money from the benefits that it's providing, that money and the eventual forgiveness of it is contingent on you keeping the same amount of employees throughout this period of time, so that when you get on the end of it, you can get as much of what you pulled from it forgiven. So if you're in a situation where they're refusing to come in and you're just paying them money, that's a little clunky, so I'd need to think that through. But I'm wondering if they'd abandon their job, and especially if they're claiming unemployment, then there's a separation from service there. So I'm not sure that they would even still be working for you at that point. Hopefully that helps. Happy to talk offline about it if you have more questions.
Absolutely. And just know that anyone who is attending that have further follow-up questions, be sure to do so. Next question is, and this may have to be answered after we find out the finalized version that's approved of the CARES Act, but how do we apply for a loan to keep employees paid and not have to pay back? So it sounds like they were talking about the grant provision, potentially forgiveness of the CARES Act.
Yeah, it just got passed as of this morning. Some of those procedural nuances weren't in the act. More often than not, those get spelled out by regulations. I would imagine that the Department of Labor, in conjunction with Oregon, Washington, and Alaska's unemployment offices, are going to come up with rules for how that's going to be processed. In the short term, I would look for guidance probably in the next week or so. They've been really responsive on that. So
excellent. And just to let everybody know, the next one for this Friday coming up, we are having a panel of bankers. So hopefully within the next week, there'll be some more guidance on that through regulation, and we might have even better answers for you with that. So stay tuned for information next week.
I would totally echo that. And Joe's the former banker, and he may disagree, but I suspect, given the kind of the total meltdown we saw when the SBA loans came out, the government just not having the infrastructure in place to process those requests, that a lot of these payroll advance and forgiveness loans will probably end up being run through the banks. Is that your hunch too, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen. So one, see how much volume goes through the SBA, and just seeing how fast they can do it. So, that reading in the tea leaves, that may be more direct the way they go with it after a week or two. So could be.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. And then we'll do this last question. We'll jump back to the presentation. This one is for Washington State, and you can answer it for Oregon as well. I am confused about what is required legally, state and federal, for a practice with less than 8 employees. The info I've gathered is really scary financially. So I guess when it comes to whether it be layoffs, whether it be with your employees, what does that look like in terms of what is legally required for a practice owner?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in the next kind of series of slides in a ton of detail. But I would say that one, absolutely, it should be terrifying to you. The government's kind of looking for you to front their cash for them for a little bit. That's the doomsday scenario. I will say this though, and I think a lot of the professionals that I've been talking to are in agreement, is on the back end, there's a lot of relief. So under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, there's going to be an almost immediate offset in your Form 941 liabilities and a refundable credit to the extent you have to put out any money for the Family First, the Coronavirus Response Act. That should help free up cash flow and make the burden on it as close to neutral as possible, though that cash will have to be at least dealt with between when you get your refund, which should be short, and when you have to front it for the employee. Two, and we'll talk about that, is the Department of Labor is releasing guidance on how small employers can apply for exemptions from the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which is the act I think you're talking about when you reference April 1st. And that guidance came out some last night. We're expecting more today. And I would encourage everyone to call their attorney or call their HR professional and see if they can qualify for an exemption if that's something they want, if they're running a small clinic with under 50 or 25 people. At a state level, many of those acts, especially in Oregon and Washington, the Family Paid Medical Leave Act, Oregon calls it something slightly different. Those are still in place, and you've either opted in or opted out. So you don't necessarily, there's nothing you can do about that, but we'll talk a lot about the new acts that are passing and some things you can do to mitigate your exposure and plan for it, because These aren't temporary things. I suspect they'll be here until at least January of next year, as people, all the scenarios kind of show two humps to COVID-19, the big one that we all get back to work, and a little one. So there's going to be a world where people are kind of coming and going from daily life and getting sick from COVID-19, and that's what these are supposed to deal with.
Awesome.
All right, let's see here. So employees, I'm getting a ton of questions about this. Fortunately, veterinarians aren't like some of my dental or medical or human medicine clients where they've been forced to lay off employees yet. A lot of them have still been able to kind of keep the trains running on time despite the burdens. My first thing I tell everyone is dust off your employee manual and take a look at it. Figure out when your benefits accrue. When does Sally in the front office get another 2 weeks of vacation? Does she get that vacation if she terminates, or do I get to keep it? Does she pay it out? All those things are less governed by statutory law and more governed by contract, which is your employee manual. If you don't have an employee manual, it gets a little case specific, but we'll talk about kind of the general rules for that. And I'll talk about this at the end, but given kind of the burden that the government is putting on employers to deal with some of these, and it's not a burden necessarily, but given the responsibilities that the government's putting on our small business owners, every employer, whether they have 3 people or 5,000 people, needs to have an employee manual to deal with COVID-19, to address some of the kind of failings of the law and the gaps in the law so that you're protected as both an employee and an owner. I'd also say call your attorney. We're here to help, especially if you use some of the medical, dental, veterinary specific attorneys in Portland, Seattle, and Oregon, and Washington, and Anchorage, and Alaska, all that stuff. Call them. We're here to help. We know it's a trying time. You guys have been such a big part of our success that I've yet to talk to a colleague who's not willing to float some time to help you. So rely on it and call your attorney for help if you need it. We'll talk about some employment specific stuff. I'll make sure to get this deck of slides to Joe so he can hand it out because we won't be able to go through everything. But again, what follows is just general information. I am not your attorney, though I'm looking at this list and actually quite a few of you, I am your attorney. So we'll have to deal with that later, but we'll go through some general rules. So if my practice closes temporarily or places some employees on temporary layoff, will my employees be able to seek unemployment? Absolutely, yes. Since COVID-19 broke out, Oregon, I think, retroactively passed a law back to March 9th, saying that Oregon calls it a temporary layoff. Washington calls it a standby layoff, where they're able to get their unemployment. They have limited responsibilities if the layoff was related to COVID-19. And it doesn't have to be that they got sick, just that the business was forced to close for COVID-19 reasons. During that layoff period, they have limited obligations to go and seek out other work, which has historically been the hallmark of a layoff. If someone's laid off and they want to get unemployment, they usually have to demonstrate, just like a terminated person would, that they're trying to find other jobs. Governor Brown and Governor Inslee have both softened that during this terrible time so that people can kind of make plans for when the practice is back up and running, when the clinic's running fully again. So I would say that 90% of my clients are, when they are forced to lay people off, are going the temporary or standby layoffs. Again, there's a ton of literature on it. If you're in Oregon, just go to the website and Google or look into it's called a temporary layoff. Washington, it's called a standby layoff. And I believe in Alaska, they just call it a layoff. Of course, they have a slight, of course, they would be simpler than us. So, so that would be my first thing. And the best thing I can say is don't hide from it. Take care of your people. You're going to need them on the back end. So help them get the resources so that they can apply. Plus, that's what you've been paying into as a business owner for all this time. So, you should want to use it. We already talked a little bit about this. What is a standby or a temporary layoff? It's a separation from service, so they do not work for you anymore. However, during the standby period, you can call them back in if you have an emergency arrive in your clinic, so you need to do an emergency surgery to save an animal's life, and you need your vet tech. You can call them in. They don't have to reapply. They will have to certify when they go to unemployment that, hey, Dr. Corey paid me $200 to come in for a day to help with a surgery, and then I did some billings and helped him with some bookkeeping. That $200 will affect their unemployment for that week, but it won't zero them out. They'll still be on unemployment for future weeks when you might not need them. This is a great resource for doctors so that you can kind of use people for the emergencies that you need and still make sure that your people are getting the unemployment that they need. I'll caveat all this when we talk about the CARES Act. Some people may choose to chase that before they go after layoffs and try and keep their payroll up and going so that they can get the debt forgiveness later, and we'll talk about that. So they are kind of mutually exclusive, but I want to walk through both separately. Historically, Washington and Oregon have only allowed 4 weeks of temporary layoff before it kind of converts into a termination. Both governors have passed some forgiveness there. Governor Brown backdated it to March 9th, and my understanding is that there's a good chance that we'll get an extension of the temporary layoff period. Governor Inslee did something similar where he's extended it out to 8 weeks, and he says that you can apply for a further extension if you need it related to your practice. So there's a lot of flexibility there. The rules are changing every day, but I think the short takeaway is that the state governments are here to make sure that people who are impacted by COVID-19 are getting the unemployment that they need. This is a really common question is, my practice is closing temporarily. Can I require they use their PTO or their vacation before applying for unemployment? The question kind of shows the confusion there that I'm getting is that oftentimes they may have a right to their vacation or PTO pay, depending on the city. If you live in Portland or Seattle and you have a city mandated PTO rules, or state, both states have those. So they may be entitled to being paid out for that. And you need to go and figure out the rules there for your specific practice. I would say that most people are in a position where the benefits that they offer their employees in terms of vacation are accrued benefits, meaning it's something they're entitled to. Even if you terminated them, they earned it. And that's based off either your clinic's policy or your employee manual. And so what a lot of my clients are doing is we write a short letter and we say, hey, we need to lay you off. You're probably going to go on temporary layoff or standby. Do you want us to pay you out for your vacation? We can do that, and we'll pay it off as a one lump time payment. You usually let that season for a week or so, and then you apply for unemployment. It shouldn't impact your unemployment since it was an accrued benefit, assuming it was. And you can be on unemployment after you got your lump sum payout. The reason we're putting it in writing is when people come back, we don't want confusion about, oh, well, I didn't know I got rid of my paid employment. I thought you were just helping me out. You know, when they come back, you will have already paid out their vacation for the year. So until they hit their next accrual point, they'll be vacationless. So you want to make sure you get that in writing with your employees so that they understand kind of that they may be burning through their vacation on the back end. All this to say is, check your employee manual. That's going to be the guiding light here. If you don't have one, figure out, what your course of dealing has been with employees before to figure out if your benefits are accrued. A lot of veterinarians do what's called a combined universal PTO policy, where they give a certain amount of days off every year, whether it's for sick, vacation, personal days. They just give a finite amount of time, and it kind of covers them for everything, all their local, state rules. And more often than not, those are accrued, but you need to check, and feel free to give your attorney a call or your HR person that helps you. Even your payroll people. So if you use Paychecks, ADP, they'll tell you how you've been handling it, so you know that your payout's done correctly and that it won't impact their ability to get unemployment down the road. I'd end this slide by saying, if this is confusing, it should be, so call some people for help. The last thing you want to do is pay out someone if that's the course you want to do, and many people aren't doing that. It's certainly not compulsory. Paying people out and then finding out it's preclusive of their employees' ability to qualify for unemployment, which frankly we haven't seen a lot of. The next slide that I'll go through really quickly, because I know we're running out of time, is the Families First Coronavirus Act. It's an expansion on the FMLA. Historically, FMLA has never been about a payment. It's never been about wages. FMLA is about job protection. So it's about if someone gets sick or needs to take an extended amount of time off, their job is secure when they get on the other side of their 12 weeks. This new act that was passed last week adds a wage component to that. So what happens in some COVID-19 specific situations where the employer needs to pay on that? We're looking to Oregon and Washington in the next week or so to give us guidance on how the Family First Coronavirus Response Act interplays with Oregon and Washington specific leave rules. You know, do they sit on top of each other? Are they duplicative of one another? But we'll get more guidance in the next week or so. The big thing I would tell people that's a huge source of confusion is that if an employee is laid off or terminated, they cannot get FMLA and they cannot qualify for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It is only for active employees. So a lot of people are saying, well, I laid someone off 2 weeks ago and I'm terrified they're going to file for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. If they're not on your books by the first, when it becomes effective, that they won't be able to draw on it from you. Next part is the way to think about this new act is in two parts. There's the emergency paid sick leave. That's for if the employee is immediately ill from COVID-19 or immediately impacted by it. And then there's the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, and that deals more for an employee is forced to take care of their family members or deal with some exigent circumstance that doesn't immediately impact them, but they need some leave protection there too. So we'll go through both really quickly. So emergency paid sick leave is available to all employees regardless of when they got hired. And it's in addition to any other paid leave into which the employee is already entitled. So you can't make them take whatever you offer them before they take their emergency paid sick leave. The employee gets to choose. Most vet clinics and hospitals are likely going to be needing to apply for an exemption. Historically, most have been exempt from FMLA because they're so small. And you need to go to the Department of Labor website and apply for an exemption, or have someone you work with, one of your professionals, help you apply for an exemption if you don't want to take part in this program. Additionally, this morning they came out with a new law. Go to the Department of Labor's website. They have a poster that you need to hang in your break room where employees can see it, that explains these new rules. It doesn't have to be hung up today. There's a grace period, but that poster, like a lot of the other OSHA posters that you have to have, will need to be hung. All employers need to do it. So who's eligible for this new act? Are you subject to a local federal quarantine order? Have you been advised that you need to quarantine due to COVID-19? Notice that it doesn't say you passed a test saying you have COVID-19. It just says a medical provider told you you need to quarantine. That's a big distinction. There's not a lot of tests, so a lot of younger people are presenting with symptoms and the doctor says, I'm not going to waste a test on you. You probably have it. You need to go home and quarantine. Are experiencing symptoms similar to COVID-19, so they don't even need to go to the doctor, or caring for an individual who's experiencing 1 through 3, so their kids, their spouse, their partner, their school has been closed, and they're experiencing a substantially similar condition to COVID-19, but they can't get a test. So under the first one, full-time employees will get up to 80 hours paid sick leave. Again, you can apply for an exemption from this if you're a small employer. And part-time employees will get a prorated amount based off their average hours worked. For associate veterinarians who are either paid off production or collections, there's a formula that the Department of Labor is coming out with that's going to explain how your compensation would be worked. Their rate is capped at $511 per day. So if for some reason you're a veterinarian who can somehow make more than that as an associate, A, good for you. And then 2, there will be a cap on how much they'll pay out for that 2-week period. And it maxes out at $5,100. So 5 days times 511, that's $5,100. And that's just for reasons 1, 2, and 3 that we see above. So those are immediately impacting you. You might have COVID-19. Employers who have to front this money, who don't request an exemption, are going to apply for a tax credit, and they'll get it on their Form 941s for what they have to pay out under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. So there will be some really quick relief if you have to front money for these issues in the future. Again, there's a hardship exemption that's available. Look to the DOL regulations or call your attorney. And then for those of us who are working for corporate veterinarians or corporate practices, this is available to you. So if you get sick, it's not a may, not a shall. If they have more than 50 employees, they're going to have to honor this new act, and you're entitled to this benefit. And my counsel to you would be in that situation is don't let anyone muscle you into taking your own PTO, your sick leave that's available to you. Run it through this, and for as long as possible, because it's a free 80 hours. The Emergency Family Medical Leave Act is a slightly modified version of that. This is for if you're dealing with 4, 5, and 6, or you need more time off. It's up to 12 weeks. So the first 2 weeks from the previous component we talked about, so an additional 10. The pay is slightly reduced. It's capped at $200 a day or $10,000 total. And again, this is also available to you if you're impacted by COVID-19 and your employer hasn't filed for an exemption. If you are an employer, it's something you would be responsible for participating in unless you qualify for an exemption. But again, you will be able to get a reduction on your taxes. So it should be mitigated slightly. So the good news, it does not apply to someone who's laid off. I've said that a few times. Some of you will email me afterwards and ask again. We're expecting some relaxation on the rules for places like Washington, New York, where school closures have been around for a long time. Anyone who has a kid would, in theory, qualify for the 12 weeks. So we're expecting some guidance from the Department of Labor on what to do if schools have been closed for an exceptional amount of time. The rules have already come out for the small business exception. You're going to get a refundable tax credit if you choose to take part in this program. And like I said, you really can't make substantive decisions about this until you talk to your employer or look at your employee manual, excuse me. I know I'm running out of time, Joe, so I'll just be really quick. The CARES Act, this was as of 9:15 today. I know it passed right before the presentation started. As far as I know, it is in the same format. The big takeaway for employers is there is a pathway where you may not have to lay people off. You can keep running a payroll and qualify for loan forgiveness later. I would expect some guidance for them about, well, what if the business really isn't operational and you're just paying people so that you can qualify for the loan forgiveness later? That is a question mark that the rules aren't currently explaining. In the short term, it subsidizes unemployment insurance, so an additional $600 a week, and a ton of other cool components to that that should be helpful. Here's kind of some of the breakdown on the rules. $350 million to the kind of the payment protection program I talked about. Some softening on the ability to pull out money from your retirement account, and then some further subsidization for loans for businesses. So I'll make sure that Joe gets that out to you so you can read it. There'll be more written about it as regulations come out in the next few days. My closing thoughts for you are, you need to update your employee manual. The Family First Response Coronavirus Act does not do a good job of explaining how employers are supposed to deal with employees who may be sick, what the requirements are to protect the employer from liability, and what questions an employer is allowed to ask of an employee if they try or if they present with symptoms or you think they might be sick, or frankly, if you think they might be taking advantage of the act. So putting that in an employee handbook is crucial, or if you don't want to do that, at least having a COVID-19 policy so that you can show if you were ever, accused of not taking appropriate precautionary measures. Hey, we had a policy. Every one of my employees is supposed to tell me immediately if they think they may have COVID-19 symptoms. The last thing I would say is rely on your team. You've been a huge part of our success. Joe at Omni, your lenders, your veterinary specific attorney, your CPA, you're the reason we have jobs. And so now is our chance to help you. Give us a call. Let us help you be successful during this difficult time. And the last thing I would say is don't be the ostrich. Don't bury your head in the sand. This CARES Act is huge. Some of the new laws that are being passed are there to help you. Use them. That's what they're there for. There's never been a time where you need to run your business more now than ever. So you just need to be as proactive as possible so that you're in a place where your practice can be successful in a post COVID-19 world where maybe there are just little flare ups or hot spots in different areas, once we flatten the curve and get on the other side of this thing. So that's all I got. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Tyler. I'll go ahead and take the screen back here. Go ahead and put this on here. What we'll do, real quick, we'll mention this because then we'll spend the last 10 minutes here for question and answer. For everyone who has to leave at the bottom of the hour, absolutely do so. We'll stay on a little bit longer just to get through some of the questions, but no obligation to stay. Next week, we're going to be having veterinary loans and COVID-19. So we're going to, at this time next week on Friday, we're going to have a panel of bankers together to talk about what sort of programs, especially as the SBA relief programs get more fleshed out and the regulations come out. It'll be very timely information to be able to see what we qualify for, what opportunities are out there. So I go ahead and encourage you to go ahead and sign up. We'll be sending it out to ortho co-sponsoring organizations, so they'll be able to go ahead and send it out too as well. And then the survey at the end of this will also have the registration link as well. So be sure to do so. And before we go ahead, Tyler and I get into the rest of the questions here, again, want to thank all the co-sponsors when it comes to the WSVMA, the OVMA, the PVMA, when it comes to this. Appreciate answering the call right away and be able to provide these resources. And just like Tyler said, he'll send me the slide deck. I will send it out to all the executive directors out there so they can disseminate it, put it on their website there for you. So you'll be able to go ahead and access everything we talked about today for you. So that all being said, we'll go ahead and get a few more questions in. And then Tyler, you let me know, respectful of your time too. I know it goes to 11:30. You let me know if you are able to stay past or if it's a hard stop.
My Uber Eats hasn't showed up yet. So once it gets here, I have to go.
It's an essential business.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll go ahead. This question can tie in together. So one is, I furloughed my employees as of today. How can I help them in this process? And what sort of documentation would I need to require for that?
Well, I think immediately I would wait and see what the full legislation of this CARES Act that passed today is going to say, and if there's been any additional guidance from the Department of Labor. If there's a world where you can borrow money to front a payroll and then get it all forgiven on the other side of this, I know a lot of doctors are going to try and take advantage of that to make sure that they get, that they can take care of their people during this difficult time. If there's limitations on that based off size and need or whatever, as the regulations come out, then I think the best thing you can do in that situation is look at your employee manual, look at your cash flow, and see if you're in a position where maybe you can pay out some of their accrued benefits and allow them to continue to draw on unemployment, whether it be a standby layoff or a temporary layoff, depending on where you're located, and just queuing them up for success so that they don't have to go out and look for other work when they're laid off to draw on unemployment. And two, that you can use them if you need them in an emergency. And then three, that, once we get on the other side of this thing, it's a pretty seamless transition for them to get back. So I'd encourage you to think about what you're willing to do. I know a lot of my clients, and I have no judgment here about it. Every practice is different and everyone's situation is different. Some of them are laying people off and then saying, but while you're laid off, I'm going to continue to pay your medical. So that's been helpful.
Absolutely. And this question, you touched upon it, just for clarification. This person has a sick employee, and by me, if they are out sick time, they think they have an undocumented case. So they haven't been, it looks like they haven't gone to physician. If this practice owner pays them, do they get to qualify for that the CARES Act to be able to go ahead and get the deduction off payroll? Or do you need to have, what sort of documentation do you need of that to be able to qualify if it's an undocumented, they think the employee thinks they have it?
Sure. So Under Oregon or Washington state law, they could immediately start drawing on their paid leave that they've been participating in, if that's what you've done in your business. And you don't necessarily need a doctor's note or anything like that. The Families First Coronavirus Act, Response Act, sorry, they added one more word than that statute should have, is not effective till April 1st. So anything you pay prior to April 1st, you won't be able to get that corresponding credit on your employment taxes for. So I would be hesitant to rely on that act now. I would look towards my employee manual to see if I can pay out sick pay for them. Look to see if we can use some of the state laws, so Washington Paid Family Leave Act or the Oregon one, to take care of them during that time if they want. And if none of that's available, you can always do advances or loans to employees that they can earn out later. You just need to make sure that that's written down if that's something you'd rather do. So there's a ton of options available to people who want to take care of their people right now.
Awesome. And then this person has a question that they have a staff member quarantined whose family member is being tested. Can they come back before the test results are back? And if it has been more than 2 weeks since testing started and no illness. So two separate questions there with a family member who has an undocumented, unsure case of whether they have COVID-19.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is this is the question why you need an employee manual or at least a COVID-19 thing in your or policy in your practice, so that you can establish these rules for your practice and the way you want things to be handled, because the law isn't particularly clear here. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to be looking out for your other clinicians and staff members in your office. If she has, I'd have to kind of chart out the timeline, but it seems like until she's no longer around someone who has COVID-19 or 14 days have expired, she's burned 14 days since her last exposure point. My understanding is that you could still potentially be a carrier. And I think that would inform whatever policy I put in place in my practice. Does that make sense, Joe?
Definitely does. Awesome.
But the only thing I would add is, we can't mandate that people go get tested right now. One, because there aren't enough tests, and two, we can't make them do that. We can't make employees share private health information with us. So we need to be delicate, but I would expect that we'll get more guidance here from the Department of Labor on what questions you can ask. But again, if you put this stuff in an employee policy that can be uniformly applied to all your staff, you get a lot of protection there, and you can get a lot more transparency about making sure people aren't coming into work with coughs or fevers.
Absolutely. And this kind of stems into this question. This is a little hyper specific, but it may be applied in other ways. So this employee had, or this practice owner had an employee who refused to abide by the stay at shelter in place laws and is having a big Easter party and claims the religious reasons and that government cannot interfere with freedom of religion. So if that's a consideration, this practice owner is interested, are they able to stop that person from coming back to work? How does that work? And what would your recommendations be?
That would be super localized, and I would give your HR provider, and I can give you some names of some that are excellent for these types of situations, or your attorney a call. You're right to be concerned, and I think that there's a pathway for you to protect your practice and protect yourself in navigating that situation. But I'm a little cagey to tell you exactly what you should do on a live recording, having not met you. So you should talk to someone, though, because that's definitely an issue you need to explore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another question before we go ahead and say goodbye to everyone who has to leave here at the bottom of the hour. This person is interested in legal considerations if they move to omit a signature on consent forms during this time.
That's interesting. I mean, one thing you can do is you can always set it up so that people can sign electronically with their phone or their iPad or at home. Two, you can always have people sign consents after the fact where you say, hey, we're going to perform the procedure in about 2 hours. I need you to run home and consent to it, and then we'll perform the procedure. I would rely on technology to be your friend there. And alternatively, if you just don't want people to physically sign something, you can always just pop a video of them and just say, hey, I'm looking at this form and I consent to this procedure. Dr. Corey's told me the pros and cons. So if that's what you're getting at, other than that, I don't know why signing in this day and age would be that big of a concern. So I would rely on technology to be your friend there.
Totally. No, thank you. And thank everybody else who is able to attend here today. This concludes the final when it comes to the on regulation time for the webinar. I just want to thank everybody who came on board. Also thanking the organizations, as well as know that we will be back here next week at the same time talking with a panel of lenders, veterinary lenders, about what options you do have. Also, just wanted to reiterate that any questions you might have, please feel free to reach out to Tyler or myself. A lot of these specific questions is best taken offline to be able to go ahead and give as much background conversation as you need, or speak with your attorney that you're working with. So with that, I want to thank everybody who came here today. Have a great weekend. Be safe out there, and through education and community, we're going to be able to get through this together. So thanks again, and have a great weekend. And that all being said, we have the Uber Eats overtime sponsor, or the overtime sponsored by Uber Eats.
Yeah, 10th inning.
Non-corporate, unofficial sponsor for the overtime.
Yeah.
So when it comes to some of these questions here that were asked last, when it comes to the, let's see here, is there a deadline, just to reiterate to anyone who's still on the line here, what is the deadline to apply for an exemption for the FFCRA?
I'm not aware of a deadline. I think the ipso facto deadline would be is that it starts April 1st. And so until you get exempted out, you're in it. And so I would try and get something filed as soon as possible. If you don't want to participate, or you're looking for that exemption. You know, if you want to participate, you don't need to do anything.
Absolutely. And when it comes to, I had a couple people here from Alaska. They were wondering in terms of attorneys that work with veterinary owners in Alaska. And I think you had said that you've done work up there as well.
Yep, I'm licensed in Alaska, and I do a ton of veterinary work up there, small animal, and then large agricultural veterinarians too. Excellent. And if you don't like me, give me a call, and I can give you some names for some other attorneys up there that you can work with too.
Perfect. Excellent. All right, let's see here. Here's a great question too. So this might be something as people go back to work, and we're seeing this, and possibly during that second hump, potentially of infection. How do we handle situations where the employee has symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, but they are not tested because of lack of testing, or they don't want to test? In order to qualify for benefits from CARES, et cetera, do the employees have to have a positive test, or could it just be the symptoms that were outlined that you spoke about?
Sure. So CARES isn't about people being sick. CARES is 100% business stuff. So loans, funding for your business to get through this difficult time. The Family First Coronavirus Response Act is about people getting sick. You do not need to require a test. What you need to do is you just need to have an employee policy that puts the obligation and says, hey, listen, it's a terminatable offense if you're coming into my office with COVID-19 type symptoms and you're not telling me, so that we can get you to either start quarantining, get you to a hospital if we need to, or take protective measures, not necessarily for the person who might be ill, but for your other staff members and the people bringing in your patients. So I think the best thing you could do in that situation is come up with just a quick one-page policy for the rules. Call your attorney. We're cranking them out all the time right now, so that you can be more proactive as opposed to reactive, or kind of looking at every employee and saying like, oh, geez, Joe looks kind of sick today. You know, you can manage the problem more proactively. Excellent. Sorry, Joe, you're a doctor and the sick vet tech today.
About to be a father in 2 months, so I'm going to be wearing a lot of hats.
Yeah.
So this next question, interesting. For everything, all these, for the CARES and for these other acts, question is, would you pull out cash out of the business now to increase the chances of receiving COVID-19 related help from government agencies? And we spoke about this. I'll let you go ahead and talk about that.
You know, I haven't read the act closely enough. If it does like a look through based off your, you know, if it's looking at your most recent month or your most recent taxable year. So it could be the issue of, you know, ripping the money out if you have made an S election or you're a corporation, and, you know, you'd be kind of giving yourself a tax liability if you're pulling money out of your business right now. So I think that that's probably a case-by-case basis you should make with your CPA. I certainly get the thought, you know, bleed it out so that you look more like a better candidate for help.
All right, you there, Tyler?
Oh, can you hear me? No?
Yeah, I
All
think
right.
so. We tapped into there's a different conversation going on there.
Oh, okay. Hey, can you hear me now?
Good.
Good? All right. Yeah, I would call your CPA to see what, because we're not sure on CARES what period of time they're looking for in terms of your financial ability. Is it the last month? Is it the last quarter? Is it your last taxable year? So it may be that ripping money out of the business and possibly incurring a tax liability doesn't really help you qualify, and you may have made your situation worse. So I would run to your professionals before I'd start uh, doing that. But I certainly get the spirit of what you're thinking, and that very well could be a viable strategy.
Yeah, and I would wait. I would definitely talk to the lenders that you currently have a loan with right now to talk about it, because there's a lot of flexibility internally with the conventional loan if you have that. I had a question here that's asking specifically about SBA copies of SBA loan apps, because if you apply too early, that the relief process, you might not qualify. I would talk with everything still in flux. There's no real, I mean, any information that was being told to you about what SBA relief programs are now is nothing that's been passed and signed by the president. Now, I don't know if he signed it here within the last hour or two, but usually, you know, there may be some line item vetoes, there may be some last minute changes when the House version and the Senate version comes together. So anything along that line, I would just be hesitant to say that, you know, with one or the other. I know between the two loans, there's two tracks you can choose from. We were talking about that earlier in the bankers panel. So there's going to be a lot more information here in the next week. I'd encourage you to come next week for sure to get absolute guidance on that. So I haven't heard some of the things that were asked in regards to the applications. But Tyler, here's a question too. This is an interesting one. I haven't thought of this one yet. But if the practice owner is trying to save as much money as possible, one way is to cut expenses by canceling their retirement simple IRA match, their 3% match. Their provider, Edward Jones, says, I'm unable to cancel the plan due to IRS rules. What will happen if they cancel the plan, if you're able to talk about that for a simple IRA there?
You know, I would just call the plan administrator, because every simple IRA is a little different. If they were to cancel the plan, generally there's a notice requirement out to employees, and then they get like a 90-day grace period to roll it over into a new plan so that they don't get popped for a taxable event. But whoever's running your simple IRA for you can get you all the information you need right away, and it'll be perfectly tailored to your specific situation.
This other one is in regards to Washington State. Governor Inslee in Washington has blocked all rent-related evictions through April. I know Portland, I believe, had a 6-month extension, don't quote me on that, of non-evictions on the residential side. Does any of this apply to business?
I am not aware that any of the governor's proclamations apply to business. I have not seen that. The city of Seattle, the mayor has passed something that does apply to businesses. To the extent I'm wrong, I would caveat everyone with saying that all those proclamations, whether it's by the mayors at various municipalities or governors, all talk about no enforcement action can be taken. What they don't really explain is what happens when that proclamation is over. So say it's a 60-day proclamation. Well, on day 61, you're still in default. You've been in default for 60 days, and now your landlord can come after you. And even if you paid the back rent, that doesn't necessarily cure the default right away. And so a lot of those things that the governors and the mayors passed are really ceremonial, and they give great relief, especially in the residential context, so that people aren't getting kicked out of their homes during this horrible time. But for a business, I'm loath, or I'd be remiss to rely upon them, because I don't know. We don't know how it would get sorted out on the back end, So they're out there, but that's one bit of relief that's come down from the government, at least in the business context, that I haven't been too impressed with, because it doesn't really say, how it gets cleaned up later on. Do you have to cut them a big check? Are you still in default? Is there interest? What about the penalties? How does all that play out? And there's been no guidance on it. So it's a 12% interest rate in most commercial leases. So if you
All right.
Is that it? Or is there more? Can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go. We got you back.
Okay.
And we'll have one or two more questions. So we'll end overtime at 1:45 here. Question for you is considerations when it comes to telemedicine logistics. Any legal guidance, anything along those lines that you'd want to be able to share with everyone still on?
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, Oregon has a ton of great guidance on telemedicine. Washington has some. A lot of that is there's an exception. There's probably a more expansive version of telemedicine available in emergency situations like this one. We talked a little bit about it of, hey, can you prescribe if you haven't had an exam in the last year? Things like that. A lot of the prescription rules can be now done on telemedicine if you meet the standards in Washington and Oregon. The standard I think Washington came out with was best judgment. And then Oregon has a slightly softer version of that. So I think telemedicine is a very viable option during this period of time. You just need to make sure that you're not skipping steps in terms of establishing your patient veterinary relationship. You're still intaking correctly with forms, and that, you're handling various consents correctly.
Thank you. This is another one too. In your experience with different laboratory contracts, have you seen any force majeure clauses in any of those contracts that you've seen in the past or typically?
I would have to go through and look. Antec contracts are usually really short, so I would be surprised if Antec had one. IDEX ones, I'd have to go back and go through some of the many that I've seen. So for you, I would say is that they work for you. So if you want to take a look at your contract, call your rep and say, send me that contract right now. I want to read it. I know that a lot of my clients are saying that everyone at Antec and IDEX are hiding. So just keep peppering them to get a look at that contract to see if it has a force majeure clause in it.
Yeah. And hopefully, in terms of everyone, I know with lenders out there, they've been very responsive. A lot of the different distributors, they've done a great job. Talk to them. So, just keep peppering them, keep talking to them. They've been working with you in some cases for years. So they want to make sure they're going to be able to work with you from years to come in the future. So absolutely have those conversations for sure. All right. And then on this last minute, Tyler, I'll open it up to you. Any pearls of wisdom, last advice for all the 70 people that are still on here in overtime that you would do or consider in these next few hours and this weekend?
Reach out to the attorney who helped you buy your practice. Reach out to the attorney who helped you with your associate vet contract if you're not an owner. Reach out to your CPA. Reach out to Joe. Reach out to professionals. We've all had a great amount of success in our careers because of working with great practitioners like yourselves, and it's our chance to give back. So if you need help or you have questions, give us a call, and I'm sure most people would be happy to chat. There's a lot here, and a lot of it's too case specific to give bright line rules. And so, you need to be precise. So I will you so you can get through this together. My second piece of advice is it's a new world order, and every business is going to need a COVID-19 employment policy going forward for how to handle some of these tough gray area questions. And so go get one, whether you get it from an HR person, a CPA, a lawyer, just get something in place so you have some metric to guide you, for these tough calls that are no doubt going to present in the next 3 to 4 months. And also thank you to all the sponsors, PVMA, Oregon Veterinary Medical Association, Washington State Veterinary Medical Association. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you all. Be safe out there. Enjoy the weekend. And don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us for any more advice offline. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great weekend. Fill out the survey afterwards. You'll see the browser pop up. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Sorry about the tech issues. Bye.